Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock, and you're watching Starfleet Tactical. I do not have Pat Doyle with me today, but instead I have Rob and TJ, who I will have introduce themselves in just a second. But first, the most important question that we ask all guests who come on the show, are you speaking for your employers?
No.
I am my own employer, but no.
Okay, so we just set the possibility of something brand spanking new happen on the show, where we're actually having somebody that if he wanted to speak for his employer, he could. But I'll note that he chose not, he's choosing to not speak for himself. Almost by definition, that's what we just heard. So I, of course, do not speak for my employer, past, present, or presumably future. Although it'd be really cool if I had an employer who I spoke for in the future. That would be cool. So let's go ahead and do the introductions. TJ, let's start with you. TJ, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm TJ. I live, actually, I have my introduction on the boilerplate on slide 2.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll have you do the introduction on slide 2 then. Rob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a longtime partner in crime for TJ, Star Trek fan going all the way back to late DS9, sneaking downstairs into the back of the TV room when my parents were watching DS9 and Voyager. So,
and if anybody who pays attention to the comments, to the chat field, will recognize both Rob and TJ because they're here almost every week, and they're very they talk in the chat a lot, et cetera, and I've made mention of the fact that we've gotten together a couple of times. And during the second of those times we got together, TJ had a slide presentation that he had put together about Star Trek captains. He'll tell you more about it, but it's basically the captains who don't get their own show, and what we can learn from seeing about these folks. And he showed it to me while Rob was charging his electric car in a very cold Walmart parking lot. We all sat around with the computer on top of the car going through a slide presentation, which is probably not the weirdest place I've ever done a slide presentation, but it certainly is honorable mention. We got a few weird looks from passerby, but hey, that's
this was the week before Christmas in a Walmart parking lot. We were not the strangest thing there.
That's true. We were not the strangest thing there in that parking lot. And so we've, it's been on the list of things to do is to invite TJ onto the show and have him do this slide presentation. And I decided that this was the time to do that because I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, I'll take anything, so I took TJ's presentation. It's not. I was sort of holding it as the strategic reserve, and Pat and I really wanted to do it at a time where both Pat and I could be here, because Pat's watched all the shows much more recently than I have, and Pat's much more likely to be able to have be a participant in the conversation, a meaningful participant than I am in terms of like remembering details of the shows and stuff. But Pat originally thought he was going to be here tonight, had to change his plans. That sort of tossed it on to me, at which point I said, I think it's time. I think it's time to call TJ in off the bench and put him into the lineup and have him do this presentation. So thank you very much to both of you for being here on such short notice. This is something that we ginned up about, 3.5 hours ago, approximately?
Well, it would have been about 6.5 hours ago if I bothered to check my email on weekends.
That's okay. At some point I realized that the right answer was to go ahead and send an email to Rob also, and Rob passed on the phone numbers required to make it happen. So it's all good. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the presentation.
Sure.
And so is there anything else anybody wants to say before we go ahead and start? All right. I think we're good then. TJ, over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. The presentation I'm going to be giving today is, as you can see, the other captains and what they tell us about Starfleet. A bit of background boilerplate. I don't speak for anybody, including myself. Bad takes are my responsibility. Good takes are purely random chance. As for what I do, I'm a freelance copy editor at the moment. I am not your copy editor. I am not my copy editor. There will probably be typos in this presentation. I tweet out under the handle @ArnieHolmes, where I am the editor-in-chief of American Rocket News. We are not a real space news agency most of the time. I have asked questions at various press conferences and gotten answers. All of the images in this slide deck are courtesy of Memory Alpha. So, which Star Trek are we going to be covering? We're going to be covering the live-action shows from 66 to 2005, movies 1 through 10, and both seasons of Lower Decks. So we're not going to be covering the animated series Discovery, Picard, Prodigy, Strange New Worlds when it comes out, the J.J. Kelvin verse, so that's Star Trek Into Darkness Beyond, any of the licensed materials. They may get referenced, but they are not the basis of this. And we're not doing non-official Star Trek, including Galaxy Quest, Orville, and the Forbidden Planet. Because as we all know, Galaxy Quest is the proper 10th movie that slots in and keeps the even-odd rule intact. So, wow, I forgot to animate this all right. Ignore that. Who does this presentation cover and not cover? We're not covering our main captains. Our main captains, lots have been said about this group. We're not covering anybody who was in the main cast as a captain in an episode. So, the other Captain Picard from All Good Things, and Captain Harry Kim from Endgame are not going to be included. We're not covering Worf or Data, both of whom captained a ship without being a captain. So we're only looking at those who have the rank of captain and the position of a captain. Nobody captaining a desk, no admirals commanding a ship. This does, however, mean that in the whole set of this slide deck, which we might not get all the way through, but if we do, Sulu, Geordi, Riker, and Gomez all can be covered because they all guest starred as a captain in another series. So we're going to start out with the first one. And we've got Matt Decker. You get a man who is thrown into a situation where he has lost his crew. He is fundamentally a broken individual, and yet he is still his first set of actions is driving towards protecting Federation citizens. He sees that as his highest duty, and even though his goals may be off, that how he achieves his goals may be off, he's still doing that. In the course of his, if you consider the fact, some of the supporting material indicates that Constellation is, in many ways, a ship that's getting ready to return in. It's getting ready for refit. It's not in as good of shape as the Enterprise is. Decker suddenly sees the Enterprise showing up very much as this, great, now I have more than twice the firepower available. I can do 2-ship combined operations. And it's very clearly that he is thinking of fleet operations with 2 ships going into this. It's not 2 ships each doing their own thing. It's actively working together to achieve the goal of destroying the planet killer.
Yeah, he's very much looking at what Kirk is doing with the Constellation the whole time he's flying the Enterprise, and having his own Kane mutiny on the bridge. I think that's the book. But
do you have any?
He really is a fascinating character. And when I first saw this presentation, and when I had a very interesting dinner with Wright Sublette down in his neck of the woods, down in Florida, who's Wright's also a fan of Matt Decker, as you guys all saw from the banner I put up there. It made me really realize that I need to go back and rewatch this episode. It's been a long time since I've seen it, and William Wyndon is just fantastic in it, and Matt Decker is just a wonderful character. And I haven't heard anything that you've said that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I think and the fact that they're having this argument about, where does their duty lie? Is the number one thing to go warn the Federation, or is the number one thing to protect people that are here that need to be protected? So it's a fantastic episode. He's a wonderful character.
And Bob, yeah. Well, let's get through the list.
So it's a long list, and TJ made some comment about we may not get through it. We'll get through the entire list. We just may not do it in one episode. In fact, our expectation is that this is going to be a two-parter episode, because there's 35, I think you said 35 captains on the list.
Yeah, so if we can make it through, yeah.
So my expectation is that this is part 1 of 2, which will be good, because then we can have Pat tag in for the next one too, hopefully. So, all right. So back to you, TJ.
Sure. Moving on, we get the Omega Glory with Captain Ronald Tracy. One of the first things I would note is that Tracy, like Kirk, is a captain. He is not a Commodore. Of the Constitution class captains we encounter, 2 of them are Commodores, 2 of them, Kirk included, are captains. And Tracy is described as being one of the most experienced captains in Starfleet. He comes off very much as I found the Fountain of Youth, I'm going to have glory, but I'm going to do everything by the book. Exactly by the book. And the way he breaks is not... He, like Decker, has lost his crew, and it sort of gets broken from that. But either he's compartmentalized the loss of his crew in a way that Decker didn't, or he's looking out for Ronald Tracy, first and foremost. And it's telling in the quote there. Captain, Kirk quotes the letter of the regulation, and Tracy's like, yes, I know, exactly. You've done your job. Now, let's move on. And he very much is... I get the impression that he would be ready to take the Enterprise from Kirk at that point, if that helped Ronald Tracy.
I think one thing that's interesting about Ronald Tracy is that he starts this by saying, those were the first words duty required you to say to me, and you've said them, you're covered. He's not saying you should say those words because they're the right thing to do. He's saying, it's very much he's expecting everyone to be playing by the letter of the law, but not the spirit necessarily. Now, again, we meet him after he's lost his ship and his whole crew. How much of this is Captain Tracy on a good day? How much of this is Captain Tracy on the day he got promoted to captain? That's an interesting question.
How much of this is Captain Tracy after he's lost?
And after the Fountain of Youth, he thinks, has dropped into his lap.
Absolutely. Moving on. We come to probably one of the more compelling of these 3 TOS captains that we encounter with Bob Wesley. Wesley is thrown in. This is the ultimate computer. Wesley has, in the various bits that we see of him, has watched the Enterprise kill literally a tenth of his crew and kill the entire crew of another Constitution-class ship. He is a man who is absolutely facing down the chance to end an existential threat to this section of the fleet. If you consider that there are only 12 constitutions and you subscribe to a small Starfleet set of theory, those 12 constitutions, we've already lost 2 crews and 1 ship, certainly. You've got the Enterprise versus 4. You've got a 1-on-4 situation. And the Enterprise has just neutralized another tenth almost of the Federation's Constitution fleet. And yet, as the line goes from Kirk, his logical selection is compassion. What does that tell us? Well, it sort of tells us that, at least with Wesley, Kirk and Wesley know each other in a way that Kirk and Tracy may not have. Now, is that because they were in different, Tracy was doing different things when Kirk was around? Is it an age difference? But Wesley fits age-wise in with the older captains. And Wesley is, in fact, a Commodore. And sort of slips in because he's not an Admiral. But it shows that, at least at this point, compassion is something that Starfleet is looking for. It may not be the most common selected element in the fleet, but it is something that they are looking for in their commanding officers.
And I think it says something interesting about the size of Starfleet, or at least the size of the portion of Starfleet that's out doing expeditionary work here. That's one of the things that's always interesting in the Marine Corps, for instance. By the time you get to 05 in the Marine Corps, you know everybody. If you're a Marine lieutenant colonel, you know pretty much the entire officer corps, because it's just that small. And if you don't know them personally, you know them by reputation, right? So that you know somebody who knows them, and it's 1 degree of separation with everybody else there. And so we don't have, I think, a full appreciation of that in the original series, but my impression is that there's a handful of ships and a handful of people out there in the frontier, and everybody knows everybody out in this section of space. It's just not that the force just isn't that big.
It's an interesting aspect of that with regards to Kirk and Tracy, that Tracy sort of fundamentally misjudges Kirk. He expects Kirk to go along with the plan he's got, which suggests he doesn't know Kirk that well.
Well, Kirk's new. He's the youngest captain in the fleet. So if he had known Tracy at all, it was almost certainly as a subordinate at some point in the past. And so it would be really interesting. I wish Kirk said how he knew Bob Wesley. Because he doesn't specify. You would have thought that if he had Bob Wesley used to be my commanding officer. I knew Bob Wesley. He doesn't say anything like that, but he does say that he knows him. So, maybe Professor Wesley at the Academy was one of his instructors or something like that. Mm-hmm. He's kind of vague on how he knows Wesley, but he knows him somehow. So
yeah, to a degree that he doesn't know either Tracy or Decker.
And we do here see a Commodore in command of 4 capital assets.
Yeah, and that's somewhat interesting how this works. This is a place where it's a little bit different from how it works in the U.S. Navy. In the U.S. Navy, Commodore is not a rank; it is a title of respect, and it is the sort of informal title for a post-command 06 who is in charge of a squadron. So he's a squadron CO, not an individual ship CO. Whereas Bob Wesley, he's sitting in the chair. He's very clearly the captain of that ship, in addition to being the senior captain present. And so this is one of those things that makes me, I'm not saying the U.S. Navy is the right way to do it and that Star Trek is wrong. I'm just saying it's different.
Though the U.S. Navy hasn't done that the same way through its entire history, as I understand it. I mean, the very early U.S. Navy, they didn't have any admirals because Congress was scared about what happens if you have a bunch of admirals. So they just made everybody a commodore. They'd assemble a group to go after the Barbary pirates or whatever, and they'd grab 3 frigates and stick them together and hang a commodore title on the commander of the biggest ship and say, have a fun 3 years.
Yeah. So, and it's also the case that at one point there was a very brief time period in 70s, the 80s, something like that, where Commodore actually was a rank.
Right, because the Navy doesn't have quite as many ranks as the other services.
They've the exact same number of ranks.
They've got Rear Admiral lower half and Rear Admiral upper half. 1 stars and 2 stars, and they're spelled differently, they're abbreviated differently, and they are 2 distinct ranks. And at one point, they just had Rear Admirals, which was a 2-star, and Commodores, which was a 1-star. But then they very quickly backed away from that. That only lasted a short time, and they sort of went back to the idea that Commodore was a squadron commander. And you talked about convoy commodores in World War II. They were the senior officer in charge of a convoy, because you didn't waste an admiral on convoy duty. You'd have a convoy commodore, and he'd be in charge of all the ships in both the military side of things and the civilian side of things. So it's the Navy is very interesting in how it sort of changes over time. We see some indications of how things change over time in Star Trek, but it's always dangerous to try to say in Star Trek they do it this way, because it covers a time period of about 200 years, more or less. A little bit more than that, I think. If you going back to Enterprise to the end of Voyager is, I knew this number mere weeks ago. It's like 267 years or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a
Enterprise. The start of Enterprise to the end of Lower Decks is 230.
Okay. So that gives us, there's a lot of time for there to be changes, right? If you go and you watch the Lore Reloaded YouTube channel, he does a lot of discussion about how Starfleet changes over time. And I'm not sure I fully agree with everything he says, but I'm going to rewatch all those videos before the next time I sit down and do a complete watch of all the different Star Trek series, because I sort of want them in the back of my head as I'm going through those shows. So I really like his stuff. Even there are times where I think he's just plain wrong. There are
probably going to be times when I'm plain wrong on this presentation too. So
yeah, I mean there's times where I'm wrong too. So in any event, Lissa put the Lore Reloaded link in the chat, so it's there if you want to go look at it. Everybody, it's a pretty nifty channel. So, all right, back to you.
Certainly. So now we're going to move on, and we hit. Those are actually the only 3 captains that we see in the original series. We flat out. There are a few captains in the court martial, but they're captaining a desk, so they don't get. Will Decker, the second Decker. The Enterprise is more than anybody's in the motion picture his ship. Maybe Scotty, but the Enterprise is his ship. He knows the ship like the back of his hand. He's just spent the past, I think it's 3 years, overseeing her refit. He is going out. He is the captain of the ship. And he gets demoted by Kirk. We only see him through the lens of Kirk having come and taken the ship back. And I sort of subscribe to the Fanon explanation that Decker and then later Spock in the Wrath of Khan are the icing on the cake of why other captains do not want to actually deal with Kirk unless they absolutely have to. We have at least 5 captains who don't come back as either intact. They either die or they come back as broken people, or they don't come back over the course of Kirk's tenure. In the form of the first Decker, Tracy, the second Decker, the unnamed captain in the Omega Glory, and then Spock. And we don't get a lot of information about Decker. What we get is that maybe he's not as brash as people tend to make Kirk out to be, but he very much is somebody who's willing to look at the regulations and say, okay, we need to do something different. Specifically, there's the setup with the phasers. Starting in the motion picture, the phasers are channeling power directly from the warp core. Kirk doesn't know it, but he thinks this is a bad idea. Decker knows it. Scotty knows it. Decker and Scotty both thought enough of it was a bad idea to set up the power. I don't remember what it's described as. Basically, the alternate power path ahead of time. They just didn't get it done before the ship had to leave space dock. I think I'm missing something. Rob, you have my...
So the other interesting thing here is that Kirk walks in and takes his ship away from him. He bumps him down and says, at best, he's playing flag captain. And really, he's getting bumped down to XO. And he's not... He's pretty professional about taking that. You know, you put 3 years into getting a ship ready for space. Yeah, and, you know, Kirk knew his father. Kirk was there when his father died. Comes in, takes his ship from him. Handles it pretty well, all told, given that situation.
Well, so this is one of those places where, you know, every now and then I run into a situation where I say to myself, is Starfleet really that different, or do the people who wrote the episode just really not get it? And that's because as the admiral aboard, admirals go to sea on ships all the time. And guess what? When they're on a ship, they're in charge. But that shouldn't mean that Decker is no longer the captain, right? What that should mean is that he's not the mission commander.
Right.
But, you know, that's how it would be in the U.S. Navy. If your boss is on board, your boss is the senior officer present, but he's not giving orders to the helmsman. Those are still going through the regular chain of command. So it's another link in the chain of command. It's not you're now demoted to this other job. And I don't have a good feel for whether this is just something that the writers didn't understand. The writers did understand, but did it for reasons involving, you know, how TV works. Or this is something where Starfleet is just different. But it doesn't make sense to me that Decker is no longer in command. It just doesn't to me.
How much of it is Kirk wanting to play captain again also?
Yeah, how much of this is Kirk is a really bad admiral?
Yes.
That could be part of it. But nobody. It's funny, there's all this, this job that you're best suited for is being captain of a ship, and Spock says things about how he shouldn't, or Spock or McCoy says he never should have accepted the promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another thing. It's like, not accept the promotion. In the U.S. Navy, the alternative to not accepting a promotion is to retire. I mean, it's up or out, right?
Yeah.
And yet we absolutely see that Starfleet does not have at least by the time we get to TNG, does not have an up or out policy.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
How much of that is just not having an up or out, or how much of it is also having to deal with a situation like the Vulcans, where if you're 40, congratulations, you're just now leaving your adolescence.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it. And there's another piece of it also, I think, and that is as lifespans change. We know that McCoy is like, what, 120 something in the TNG.
Right around 140.
140. Yeah. Okay, so he's an old guy, but so we know that the lifespan for somebody born when McCoy was born can be as high as 140. I wonder what the lifespan for Jean-Luc Picard would be normally.
Yeah.
I mean, he was born a lot later. Medical technology is that much better. And so maybe it is our up or out system. It's just a lot slower.
Well, there's an interesting aspect to that and we're not going to be covering captains from Picard, but we see Picard's career track in two or three different timelines. When in All Good Things and of course in Picard, and in some of them, by 20 years after the events of the show, he's out of the service. I think in more than one of them. But McCoy is still in uniform, if I recall correctly. Now he's probably behind a desk at Starfleet Medical. He may be behind a desk at Starfleet Academy's medical division, but he's still in uniform. Whereas
maybe. And the reason why I say that is, so when a friend of mine retired, one of my coworkers at the Naval War College, when he retired, we were talking about basically being retired and stuff. And at some point, I can't remember how it came up, but he said that he's still authorized to wear the uniform. And there are times where it would be considered, that like if he's there in a situation like at a veterans parade or something like that, or there are certain formal occasions where it would be totally natural for him to wear the uniform and still be, basically a representative of the United States Navy, even though he's now retired.
That's a valid point, and the commissioning of a new ship probably falls under that. So that you're right. That may not be strong evidence.
Yeah, this might be like a World War II vet putting on his old uniform.
That's a very good point. I'd need to go back and rewatch Farpoint and see if they ever actually refer to him with the implication of a serving rank as opposed to a retired rank.
Yeah, and I don't have a good feel for that, and I'm not. They may not really differentiate. It may be also one of those things. Like, for instance, 5-star admirals don't retire; they go inactive, but they don't retire. They're considered to be on active duty, and they get active duty pay until the day they die. They just no longer are given assignments.
Yeah.
But for some reason, this reminded me of a book by Kevin O'Donnell called Fire on the Border, where in that book, anti-aging technology's gotten to the point where people have just stupidly long lifespans. And so the solution that the Navy has is that you can do 20 years of active duty at any given time. And then you have to take, I think it's a 5-year break. And then you can come back, but you have to take a break. You can't just keep on serving. And what usually ends up happening is that's when, if an officer decides he wants to go off and get his PhD, that's when he goes off and gets his PhD or something like that. And then they'll come back into service if they decide they want to come back. But you're basically, you're done after 20, and you can just do as many of those 20-year periods as you want, but you just have to separate them by 5 years. In the Honor Harrington books, you run into some issues with anti-aging technology is relatively new, and I've made the comment to David Weber, and he said it's there. It's just not obvious that it has huge potential to screw up the Manticoran Navy. It doesn't, because they know the war's coming, and they know that they're going to be expanding. So the idea that you've got all these officers that never get old and die of old age and never retire because they're old, that's a feature, not a bug, because you've got the severe manpower shortage.
Yeah.
Okay, so think that through a little bit further. What happens if you don't have a convenient, existential threat war on the horizon? What happens in that situation?
You have to wonder what the Andermanis are doing in that same situation, since I think their medical technology is pretty similar.
Yeah, and it's the Andermani are just interesting from beginning to end. I love the Andermani. I love the Andermani. German-speaking Chinese.
Yes.
Moving on.
Moving on.
We come to Captain Terrell of the Reliant. He is the first of what I will describe as the bus drivers in Starfleet, and yet he is driving a bus on a Miranda, a ship that is patently the match, if equipped with a full crew, would patently be the match of a Constitution.
Actually outmasses a Constitution, or at least out volumes a Constitution, if you compare just the displacement of the models.
That extra stuff on the saucer is bigger than the Connie's engineering hull when it comes down to it.
Though, granted, a natural gas carrier outmasses an aircraft carrier, so there may be some accounting for difference. But anyway.
When confronted with Khan, he's never even met Admiral Kirk. So this sort of drives that maybe Starfleet is a little bigger. The implication is that he knows of Kirk, but he's never met him. So a little bit bigger of a fleet. And his solution to the no-win scenario ends up being suicide. He is confronted with either he shoots Kirk at Khan's order, or he doesn't shoot Kirk, and the parasite that is mind controlling him does whatever the ear brainworm thing does. And as you see there, the suicide is not an acceptable way out in the vast majority of situations. So while it can be understood why he shot himself as opposed to shooting Kirk, then there's your national suicide prevention lifeline. If you're feeling that way, talk to somebody.
So I think this is now one thing about this is he may be doing slightly different things. Like TJ was saying, he's on an internal survey mission. He's not on a border exploration mission. So it may just be a matter of different roles within the fleet, or that Kirk is now an admiral, but he's very much, he's never met Kirk.
It might also be a geographic / astrographic situation. The comment has been made, and this used to be really, really true, that there wasn't one U.S. Navy. There were two U.S. Navies, one of which was based on the East Coast, one of which was based on the West Coast. And it wasn't unusual. If you talk to those guys, it wasn't unusual. You move around between ports, but you probably stayed on the same coast. So you had med guys and you had pack fleet guys. And so it might very well be that that Terrell, until recently, was just on the other side of the Federation, that there's an entirely different group of people over there that are sort of doing the thing on the other side, right?
Mhm.
In Lord of the Rings, we only hear about the stuff to the west of Mordor, but we know there's an entire continent to the east and things are happening there. And so it might very well be that he's just, he made a name for himself and he came up on the other side, but they moved him over to this side because they needed him there. And, with long travel times, the Federation is getting much, much bigger. And despite what we see in Star Trek First Contact, where everything is right next to each other, you can still expect some long travel times. And so it makes perfect sense that that if you were out in one neighborhood, you'd probably stay out there.
Yeah.
So
David Coxwell, how did Khan and Chekhov meet, even though we never saw him in Space Seed? I think the standard fanon explanation is they ran into each other in the mess hall.
The Enterprise has 400 crew members. I don't think we see 400 different extras over the course of the entire series. There were bound to be people on the Enterprise we just didn't see. Chekhov was someplace, he just wasn't bridge crew yet.
Yeah, or the other alternative, which makes a total amount of sense to me, is that if you went to a ship as storied as the Enterprise, you'd probably spend a little bit of time, reading the old log reports and trying to figure out what happened.
I think Khan recognizes Chekhov, though. If I
don't
recall,
remember which way it is. I would have to rewatch the movie.
Chekhov says Botany Bay. I know that ship, but I think Khan recognizes Chekhov.
Oh, that could be.
But I like the excuse that he cut him off on the way to the bathroom.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that face, that haircut.
He took the last chocolate pudding.
Yeah. Do you have any idea? Yeah, Chef only makes it takes so much time on the protein synthesizer. All right.
JT Esteban, captain of the Grissom. He does by the book. Everything by the book. He's trusted to deal with Genesis, but he's calling home. He calls home 3 times in 20 minutes that we see. So trusted to deal with the classified situation, but not. He's calling home, and the other part is, even when doing that, he still manages to get himself caught out. The first clue that anything for him has gone wrong is when he can't call home. And rather than raise shields at that point, it's like, hey, what's going on? There's a delay in getting it done. He's the second of our bus drivers, and he's very much sort of a kind of a non-entity. But he's also
clearly someone who never recognized the wisdom that a communications disruption can mean only one thing.
Yes. Yes, thanks, Vin. I didn't remember the line. Styles on the Excelsior. Oh, man, Styles. God, man, is he a piece of work. Absolutely horrible lack of tact with Commander Scott. One of the things, if you pulling from, I know we said we weren't reference material. I break my own rules. If I can't break my own rules, whose rules can I break? If you go by the novelizations, Sulu was set to, following the training cruise that led to the Wrath of Khan, Sulu was set to be the commander of Excelsior. Sulu was set to get the promotion and take command of Excelsior. So is Styles the guy that was working Excelsior up? Is Styles the guy that they pulled in when Sulu was suddenly not going to be around following the events of the Wrath of Khan? We don't know, but the man has a horrible lack of tact. Commander Scott. Especially carrying around the swagger stick.
Which is an interesting affectation we never see anyone else in the fleet have.
So James B. Sicking, however you pronounce his last name, he's kind of made a career for himself playing that character, right? Because it's pretty close to the same character he played in Hill Street Blues. So competent but arrogant. So you get I always got the impression that, like 9 times out of 10, there's some guys who write checks that their ego writes checks that their body can't cash. I get the impression that he's generally able to perform at the level that his demands of him. But every now and then that doesn't, every now and then he gets outsmarted.
Yeah.
Olam, somebody mentioned that there was William Curry. My understanding is that they tried shooting that video, and Shatner wouldn't actually act for those scenes, which is why it got cut from the motion pit. Why it got cut from the movie The Wrath of Khan. But it's in the novelization.
Which scene is this?
Talking about Sulu getting captaincy of the Excelsior. I've not seen it, but I have heard that it... How did Sulu get captain of the Excelsior over Styles? You've got... what? 5 years?
You've got
between 5 and 10 years from the events of the voyage home and the undiscovered country.
Yeah, and depending upon when he became captain in the U.S. Navy, it might be unusual. It might be. So I've got a friend who's a Navy captain. His ship is not yet built. They're building it. Even as we speak, they're building it, but it's not built yet. And he hopes that there aren't any delays so he can actually take this ship that he's captain of to sea. So, because that's how that works. So if Styles has been captain of the Excelsior during her workups and all this other stuff, during the construction period, pre-commissioning unit, etc., he might be this might be the only time he's going to space on Excelsior as a commissioned unit, and so that'd make me a little cocky too, I guess, if he sort of viewed that as one opportunity.
It's entirely possible his career on Excelsior ends about the same time she's recommissioned from an NX to an NCC.
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Anyway.
Different styles, Olam. Completely different styles. Yeah, and Styles might have been the seat warmer. Joel Randolph, the Yorktown. We're doing the voyage home ones out of order because it worked better this way. We know nothing about the guy. We have almost no dialogue. That they are attempting to build a solar sail to generate electrical power. There's a concept called a Q drive that would do that. The tough SF people know what the Q drive is. I can't describe it. I don't get it. There's we've got very little about him. Well, sort of what I'm going to touch on is also in this next one. We don't know her name, but in the voyage home, this is actually the first instance we have seen of a woman commanding, production-wise, of a woman commanding a ship in Star Trek. She's captaining the Saratoga. This is a Miranda, and there is the line that it is 2 starships and 3 smaller vessels. We see Saratoga and Yorktown, the presumption that those are the starships. Those are fleet assets that the loss of which is mentioned to the Federation president. Now, is that fleet assets in sort of the way that a cruiser is a fleet asset? No, this is not LaForge's mom. She's in this, but she's in TNG, and we are almost out of time. We don't see much about her. We don't see much about either of the captains, but these are ships that are a Miranda is probably one of the 2 starships, and also 3 smaller vessels. So, Oberth-sized, other Federation ships potentially smaller than a Constitution.
David, we're not covering the animated series in this, and Uhura is in the cast list, so she would be excluded on both counts. But I think there is an episode where she does command the ship in the animated series.
Yeah, sounds about right. Hikaru Sulu. Why is he here? Because he's in Voyager episode flashback. Because Tuvok was on his ship. Absolutely dedicated to his former crew. Absolutely aware that Vulcans have a sense of humor. It's a lot of people have said a lot of things about Sulu. I don't really have a whole lot I can add that other people haven't said. Chris, you look like you've got a...
No, I was just reading some of the comments about Saratoga. Bob, in fact, me. Which I thought was a nifty comment.
Side note, George Takei had to have his uniform taken. They had his uniform from the Undiscovered Country when they filmed the new scenes for Voyager. They had to have his uniform taken in. It was too big on him.
That's not the way that usually works.
No,
and it's also funny because if you look at take a look sometime at Geordi's uniform in, I think it's First Contact.
It's
Generations where they're wearing uniforms that they got from the
DS9 casting office. He's
yeah, and so it's basically like this almost fits you. They're really pretty bad.
Yeah, they got very bad in the Paramount got very, very cheap on the casting department.
I think looking at time, we're going to just about make it. We've got one more slide, and then we're through the TOS and TOS movies. So.
Yep. So that'll be a good break point. We get John Harriman, captain of the Enterprise B. This guy gets horribly vilified in a lot of fan discussions. And while I say that, I've sort of come around to a different position even than what this slide says. I forgot to change it. He definitely, the situation he is in, he is out of his depth. He knows he has a semi-functional starship. He knows that the starship is not ready, which implies to me that it was being pushed for a commissioning date. And yes, Matthew, she was captain of the Saratoga. But at the same time, he knows that he's out. He knows that he is not the ship that should be responding to this distress call. He really shouldn't be the ship, seeing as he's still in the solar system and the only ship within range. And yet, once he knows that he's the only ship within range, he doesn't really hesitate. He goes out. How much of that is Harriman and how much of that is there is Kirk on your bridge? If you do not do what Kirk would do, you have to deal with Kirk glaring at you for the rest of the trip. And yet he is still doing his job to the best of his ability, even while he is thrown off his game by the fact of both having to be in a situation the ship is not ready for and having Kirk on his bridge. I think I've missed something, Rob.
There are a couple interesting points about that. He the standing joke from him, the line that is most memorable from him is this whole "let me guess Tuesday" thing. There's a whole bunch of the stuff that should be arriving like next week. Something got held up in the pipeline somewhere, or somebody was aiming for the 10th anniversary of the launch of the original, the 30th anniversary of the original Enterprise or something. But there's a few things that are late, and so they're just going to do a quick cruise around the solar system and come home. It's like Gilligan's Island. And if you're doing Gilligan's Island, it doesn't matter that the photon torpedoes aren't ready or whatever. You don't have warlords aboard or whatever. And he knows exactly what his ship doesn't have. There's not a scene of him being shocked he doesn't have something on board. Kirk is shocked because he thought this was a starship, but it's not quite a starship yet. It's like the Ford 4 years ago. It's not quite an aircraft carrier.
And yet...
And knowing exactly what your ship doesn't have is sometimes the most important thing. If you know your battle cruiser isn't a battleship, that's a really important thing to know from a mission perspective.
Exactly. I think that, yes, that covers our... It was a preview for next time.
Okay.
Yeah, I would argue preparing this, I came around on Harriman. Harriman is somebody who's had a lot of jokes at his expense. There's a lot of people who think he was another Styles, somebody who shouldn't have been in the spot where he was. And there's truth to that, but the problem wasn't necessarily him. The problem was the readiness state of the ship and being the only ship in the section, or in the sector.
And in the books, in the Lost Era books, his father is an admiral, and he was sort of brought up as the golden child and is seen as actually very competent. And in the Lost Era, the Lost Era books completely turn around. He is a competent and establishes himself as one of the great Enterprise commanders. We really don't have any bad Enterprise commanders that we ever see, though. So, that I think will wraps up our first exploration, and the next sections would be TNG, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, and Lower Decks.
So thank you very much, TJ and Rob, for starting off on this presentation. I'm looking forward to doing the remainder of it. So one last thing before we go. Is there anything, actually one other last thing, let me do that. Is there anything that you guys would like to talk about in terms of like what other stuff you've done online, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So
sure, yeah. TJ and I have cooperated on I write a lot of alternate histories of spaceflight, so counterfactual histories. TJ and I have one that came out last year called Boldly Going, a history of Space Station Enterprise. Speaking of apropos.
Oh, let me get.
And it's sort of a novella, novel length, sort of alternate technical program history. I've got a couple others. Eyes Turn Skyward, which is no shuttle. Right Side Up, which is a different shuttle, and then we've also written a few short timelines. We had one about the B-58 as a supersonic transport before Concorde.
Last of the Clippers was that one. Rob has written Morning of the Maple Leaf, which is about the Canadian space program, and Dawn of the Dragon, which is about the Chinese space program. And we have another timeline
in the works.
I can't drop.
What?
Oh, never mind. It's going to drop a link. Never mind.
So
yeah, Rob goes by Rob goes by E of Pi online, and I go by either TJ Cezadlo, which is my name, or Arnie Holmes. I tweet out space history stuff. If you like space history stuff, that's
so. All right, so I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
I
really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. Don't run away after she stops the show. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
I can't.